thought I would start my introduction by reading an article by one of the leading economic and political commentators of the Financial Times, in an article he's only just published this afternoon. And I'm going to read the opening paragraph. He says, "A new world is being born. The hope for peaceful relations is fading. Instead, we have Russia's war on Ukraine, threats of nuclear Armageddon, a mobilized West, an alliance of autocracies, unprecedented economic sanctions, and a huge energy and food shock. No one knows what will happen, but we do know this looks to be a disaster." That's written by Martin Wolf, one of the leading columnists of the Financial Times. Now, the reason why I'm making that point is because we're all kind of locked into our daily routines. We all have daily routines and we live by those routines. And to a certain extent, that applies to politics as well. So we have fortnightly Zoom meetings and we have labour movement meetings and so on. But I don't think you can overemphasize how significant this war is. It's like 9/11, or perhaps even bigger. It's an important turning point, economically, politically, and geopolitically. And all of the routines that we're used to will be up for challenge. I mean, if you live in the Ukraine, you've got no routines any longer. And we haven't been subjected to that kind of difficulty at the moment. But in terms of living standards, in terms of food prices and energy prices in particular, we are going to face unprecedented shocks. Ted Grant used to say, this is in the 80s, that we live in a period of sharp turns and sudden changes. But really, that's nothing, absolutely nothing compared to the upheavals and the convulsions that we will face politically. I'm approaching this discussion from the point of view that Left Horizons has always had the attitude that we don't claim to know all of the answers. We don't know all of the answers. We published on the website a statement by the Executive Council of Unite and a similar statement by the FBU. And if you look carefully at them, and I'll mention this later, there are actually subtle differences in what they say. One thing that's clear with both of them, which we would agree with, I think, which Left Horizons has already put in articles, is that we support an independent class position. That we see this war and the invasion not from the point of view of flag waving or nationalism, but from the point of view of the interests of the working class in Russia, Ukraine, and in the rest of the world. And we've opposed that invasion. We've opposed that war from the standpoint of the working class. But it's a military adventure that's based upon the interests of a tiny oligarchy, a tiny handful of people at the top in Russian society who are jealous of their prestige, of their international position, of their international prestige, and what it means in terms of having lost prestige. And they've adopted the attitude that this far and no further. They're not going to relinquish any more of their previous sphere of influence. But on the other hand, we're also opposed to NATO. NATO played a considerable part in provoking this conflict by expanding its influence right across Eastern Europe. There are 13 states altogether, which were either formerly Stalinist states or even parts of the USSR, which are now part of NATO. And there have been certainly hints and suggestions, at least there were up until recently, that Ukraine would join them, that Ukraine would become a part of NATO. And we don't support NATO in any shape or form. NATO is a kind of a collective military alliance of the main capitalist states, completely dominated by the United States, of course. And NATO has played a reactionary role wherever it's kind of stuck its oar in, whether that's bombing Libya or invading Iraq or bombing Syria or bombing Belgrade 20 years ago. And of course, we know that the United States itself has intervened in dozens of countries around the world. And, you know, we've got to point to that hypocrisy. I did see on Facebook somebody actually making a comment about refer to this as whataboutery, you know, that it's a bit of a Guardian-esque expression. But I think you have to do that. You have to point to the hypocrisy of NATO. You have to point to the hypocrisy of the press, because knowing that they're complete and utter hypocrites helps to inform your judgment about what they're saying in the media, what they're saying in the press, and so on. But overall, it will be workers. It will not be rich people. It will not be the well-to-do. It will not be the elites. It will be workers who are going to pay a price for this war. Beginning, of course, with the Ukrainian workers who are paying an extremely heavy price. 3 million, I believe, are now refugees outside of Ukraine. There's probably half that number have moved inside Ukraine itself, and they are paying a heavy price in terms of casualties as well. But Russian workers also will pay a price, not only the soldiers. I did see a reference on a Russian website today about conscript soldiers. There were conscripts in the initial invasion, although we were led to believe that there wasn't, but there were conscripts, and some of their comments have been reported in the small amount of opposition press that there still is in Russia. But we're all going to pay a price in terms of living standards, in terms of cuts, in terms of higher expenditure that will be expected on defence and things of that kind. In a sense, we're going to pay a price in terms of political reaction. You can see the political reaction now in the way that Johnson is kind of doing his best to emulate Winston Churchill. He's waving the Union Jack as furiously as he can. And of course, Keir Starmer's backing him up. He's wrapped himself in the Union Jack as well. And you can see the political reaction, the growth of nationalism. We're discussing one particular aspect of this war, though inevitably other things will come in. And I think it's important to make the point, even though there's a war on, as far as we are concerned, normal politics is not suspended. We didn't suspend normal politics during COVID. Even if Boris Johnson accidentally got some things right, like lockdown measures and things like that. The COVID pandemic for Johnson and the Tories was really an opportunity to enrich himself, enrich his friends and things like that. And anything that was done properly and correctly, as it were, was done by accident. It was a policy and a program of self-enrichment, and that's the entirety of it. Tens of billions of pounds were filched really from the taxpayer. And we said at that time, even during COVID, that the normal politics continues, but that goes for foreign policy and war as well. And what the Tories are doing now, what they're saying, what they're doing, sanctions they're imposing, statements they're making, are not at all in the interest of Ukrainian workers. They couldn't give a shit about Ukrainian workers, to be blunt about it. That what they're doing and what they're saying is what they believe is in the best interests of British capitalism. That's the reason for all the grandstanding. That's the reason for all the waving the Union Jack. It's a bit of a joke, really, because the United Kingdom, in military terms, is a second or third-rate military power. But of course, Johnson still looks to the development of prestige internationally, because international prestige does have a meaning. It does have an end result, and that end result is, hopefully for them, markets, raw materials, influences, and profits. And we shouldn't forget also that a lot of what the Tory party are doing and saying is to boost the Tory party at home. We've suggested in an article that there may be even something of a kind of a Falklands factor coming out of this war. It didn't seem to show itself in the Erdington by-election, but it's still a possibility. Remember, Margaret Thatcher was able to bask in a certain degree of glory after the Falklands victory in 1982. And that was one of the factors. It wasn't the only one, but it was one of the factors that led to the Tory victory, the Thatcher victory in the general election in 1983. So those kind of things are really what the Tories are looking at. They're looking at longer term, the possibility of greater prestige in Eastern Europe, which means, as I say, it means a wider market for British goods. It means raw materials, influence, and finally for profit. When it comes to the policies that they've introduced in Ukraine, those policies are full of holes. It's very interesting to look at the sanctions against the oligarchs, for example. We were talking before the meeting started about Abramovich. Roman Abramovich was the subject of the Panorama story, the Panorama program last night. And the man is an out-and-out crook. There's no two ways about it. He's like Del Boy, and he's managed to fleece the Russian people of billions and billions of dollars, and that's why he's rich. Now, all of this has been in the public domain for 10 or 15 years, ever since Boris Berezovsky tried to sue him in 2012. And now all of a sudden it's on Panorama as if it's news, and it's not really news. It's suddenly been a big issue when London has been full of rich Russian oligarchs for years. In fact, the Tory party has had, I believe, something of the order of £20 million from a variety of Russian oligarchs. And it's interesting that those oligarchs who've been sanctioned are a very small minority of those who have big properties in London. Like there's this guy Lebedev. Lebedev is actually in the House of Lords. So here he is, a peer of the realm. Theoretically, he has influence over what you and I pay in taxes, over the laws that affect you and I. Yet the only reason he's in the House of Lords is because he's a mate of Boris Johnson's, and he's a mate of Boris Johnson's because his old man was a Russian oligarch, a Russian billionaire. Why did Lebedev Sr., how did Lebedev Sr. come to have billions of dollars? Well, he just happened to be a leading member of the KGB in the late 1980s and early 1990s. He's another thief. He's another white boy. And London has been thick with Russian oligarchs. And the fact that Boris Johnson has sanctioned a few of them doesn't take away the fact that that fact that they've tolerated these thieves, these latter-day robber barons. They've tolerated them for decades. Roman Abramovich had what was called a golden visa, which meant he was able to come and live for as long as he liked in Britain, so long as he brought his money with him. And according to the Panorama program last night, there were 2,500 golden visas given to rich Russians. They weren't all billionaires, but they must have been quite near it. So the measures that the Tories are introducing in terms of sanctions are really a joke. Even the new economic crime bill that's going through Parliament is a joke. It's got so many loopholes, you could drive a coach and horses through it. It looks at the beneficial ownership of shell companies, but the beneficial ownership is only counts if you've got a 25% ownership. So it just needs the oligarch to give his wife 19% and his daughter 19% and his son-in-law 19%, and all of a sudden nobody's got beneficial ownership. So the shell company is still a secret. And then they can own property, as Putin has done for years, through trustworthy nominees. And the main thing, of course, is that all of these tax havens that are under British control, like the British Virgin Islands, the Cayman Islands, Belize, Bahamas, all of these British tax havens are completely untouched. It's been suggested that London is the dirtiest money capital of the world. It's the world's laundromat for laundering dirty money, and none of that is going to change. None of that is going to change, apart from the fortunes of perhaps 2 or 3 or half a dozen oligarchs. We would support the socialists, and I think we should argue that we should that what would be justified would be the confiscation. And I mean confiscation, I don't mean freezing. Abramovich has his assets frozen. When this war's over, perhaps in a couple of years' time, he might get his money back. No, we should have the attitude that their assets should be confiscated. There's a lot of big properties in the West End of London. Abramovich was worth 150 million. Lebedev has a property worth 60 million. And there's a lot of them. And these would make very good homes for refugees, very good properties to build refugees, for homeless refugees, and not just from Ukraine either, but from other places as well. And it's been suggested, for example, that if we're going to freeze all of their assets and their money, that some of that could be used for investment in renewable energy, so that then perhaps Western Europe would be less dependent on Russian oil or gas, or any oil or gas if it comes to that. The embargo that Johnson has announced on Russian oil and gas is also a bit of a joke, to be honest, because Britain and the USA, if it comes to that, get very little oil and gas from Russia. I read a couple of days ago that we get no petrol whatsoever from Russia, and we get about 5% of our diesel from Russia. The United States gets none at all. And again, you can see through these people. The Shell company, the big giant company, which is profiteering now from high world oil prices, Shell has announced that it's withdrawing from Russia. But that happened to be 2 days after they bought a Russian tanker full of oil. They apologized afterwards. Oh, sorry, we bought this oil on the cheap. We will make lots of money on it. We're sorry about it. We apologized afterwards. But these people are complete sharks, complete snakes, and you can't trust them at all. The United States is in a position, if they can persuade Northern Europe not to take any Russian oil or gas, they're in a position where they can sell more oil or gas to Northern Europe as liquefied natural gas and so on. So they're thinking of themselves. All of these separate capitalist classes are thinking of themselves. And of course, for those who are against sanctions, the same applies. The German capitalist class has also said, well, we can't implement sanctions because 40% of our natural gas and 50% of our oil comes from Russia. So the Germans are against sanctions. So the sanctions won't apply. And even the sanctions against this SWIFT, this kind of electronic SWIFT payment system for financial transactions electronically, even that has kicked out a lot of Russian banks, but not all Russian banks, because the Germans are going to continue to get Russian oil and gas. The Dutch are going to continue to get Russian oil and gas, and they're going to have to pay for it through the loopholes in the SWIFT system. So all in all, we should have I think we should have the view that we don't support the domestic policies of British capitalism and its political representatives, and neither should we support its foreign policies. When it comes to NATO, as I've said, I think there's a lot of discussion. I think in the left generally, or some discussion anyway in the left, about the giving arms and supporting Ukraine in terms of arms. And of course, the Ukrainian president has actually said, that when it comes to assistance, I don't want to lift. In other words, he doesn't want to leave Kiev. I don't want to lift. I want arms. That's what he said. And there's been some discussion on this. Now, my view is that we should be against NATO arming Ukraine. We should be against the expansion of Ukraine into Eastern Europe. NATO, as I say, is dominated by the United States. Its expansion into Eastern Europe isn't just purely a military issue. It's an issue of prestige, but primarily it's an issue of gaining markets, raw materials, and profits. Although obviously the Russians have used that as a pretext for war. If NATO was to openly supply arms to Ukraine, in effect, it would be Ukraine would become a de facto member of NATO. But that's not going to happen, however. NATO is not going to get involved. NATO has said, the NATO officially, that is not going to be in a position to impose a no-fly zone. It's very interesting that the Russians have conducted some rocket attacks right in the west of Ukraine recently, one within, I think, 90 miles of the Polish border. Now, that really wasn't for strategic military reasons, although the place that they hit was a training camp where NATO arms were being used. But it was really a political statement. It was a statement to NATO not to get involved. And the NATO said quite clearly, we are not going to get into a war with Russia over the Ukraine. And NATO is not openly coordinating the shipment of arms to Ukraine. I think it's possible that behind the scenes they might be doing it on the quiet, but certainly they're not openly coordinating the importation of arms from Slovakia or Poland or anywhere else for that matter. I don't know if you saw in the newspapers a week ago, but the Polish government offered to give MiG jets to the Ukraine. MiG jets are particularly useful because the Ukrainian Air Force will have used MiG jets, they're trained in MiG jets, and they're familiar with MiG jets. And the Polish government offered to give these MiG jets to the Ukraine. And but they didn't want to do it themselves. They didn't want to fly the jets from Poland into Ukraine because of the provocation that would have seemed to be a provocation. And so they wanted to give them to the Americans, or the Americans to give them to Ukraine. And the Americans said, no, 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 we aren't going to give those jets to the Ukraine. So NATO is standing off. NATO is standing aside at the moment. They're not prepared to get involved in a conflict, not prepared to get in a direct conflict or a direct confrontation with Russia. Now, what about this question of arms? Now, this is where I want to come to the difference between the statement by the Fire Brigades Union and Unite, because there's a section in the Fire Brigades Union statement which I think is very, very good. I'm going to read it out. It says, "We support workers in Ukraine acting independently of the Zelensky regime and building their own organizations and taking independent action. This should include attempts to build dialogue and links with rank and file troops in the invading Russian forces." Now, the interesting thing about that is that what it's implying is that the defense of Ukraine by workers is much less a question of arms as it is a question of morale and a question of politics. And the Zelensky government, as much as the Zelensky government conducts its defense based upon waving a blue and yellow flag and being an anti-Russian defense, as much as it does that, it will actually bolster the Russian armed forces, but on the basis of a defense that's, if you like, a political defense based upon an appeal to Russian soldiers, it's more likely to have a much bigger effect. It's very interesting that in the one big city where that Russia is captured, that's Kherson in the south, there have been constant demonstrations by civilians, by Ukrainian civilians, and they've been talking to Russian troops. And that, more than anything else, will undermine the morale and really shake the morale of ordinary Russian troops. That's the kind of attitude we should adopt. You know, it's very, very difficult, and it's very tempting when you see television pictures of the horror, really, that's being faced by ordinary people in Ukraine. It's very tempting just to say, send them arms, send them arms. But we should be very, very careful about that particular appeal and that particular idea, because inevitably, if you end up in the camp where you're supporting NATO arms, effectively what you're saying is that NATO should become a de facto member of, that Ukraine should become a de facto member of NATO, and I think we should oppose that. I want to say something about general trade with Russia, because early on in the war, I haven't seen any more reports of it since, but early on in the war, there were reports of dockers in Britain, and I think in the continent as well, who were boycotting Russian goods and Russian oil. And I think that's understandable, really. It was a kind of an ordinary instinctive workers' reaction to the war, to what was happening. But I think we should actually say, no, we're against sanctions, particularly sanctions that will deprive Russian or Ukrainian workers of food, medicines, essentials, and things like that. Many Russian guest workers in Western Europe would normally send remittances, they'd normally send money to their families in Russia. And if they're blocked from doing that, then we should be opposed to that. The experience of sanctions in the past hasn't been a positive one. In discussions with comrades in Russia, they reported that when sanctions were introduced against Russia in 2014, remember at the time of the occupation of Crimea, it didn't actually undermine the regime, it strengthened the regime. It gave the impression that it was the West, it was NATO again. And the government was able to play on that and actually enhance its support. The same was true in Iran. the imposition of sanctions in Iran, particularly by the United States, but by the West in general, it drastically affected the Iranian economy, but it did not in and of itself undermine the Iranian government. So we should be very, very wary about the whole question about sanctions. I haven't got time to deal with other examples of sanctions and other examples of similar movements. I know that I was involved, some of the comrades here would have been involved in the struggle against South African apartheid. And of course, in the present time, there's a campaign for a boycott, disinvestment and sanctions against Israel, the BDS movement against Israel. So I'll just leave it at that, but I just want to finish with another comment, really. Dramatic. We're living in a period of great drama, of great political upheavals and convulsions. Not something of our making. It's what you might call, it sounds a little bit 1930s Trotsky, but it's the death throes, really, of a system that's in historic decline. And as much as the invasion of the Ukraine was, if you like, unthinkable, the unthinkable has happened. The unthinkable is kind of going to be the norm from now on. You know, I mean, this is not new in politics. You know, you go through a political period where what seems to be insane becomes sane. People are questioning Putin's sanity. It's not a question of sanity. You haven't got to base an analysis upon individuals in that way. But politically, it seems insane. But that's the normal. What seems to be mad has become the new normal. That's the political period in which we live. And there's no getting away from that. We cannot get away from that. We cannot get out of that. And our main responsibility, I think, is to discuss things, to try to understand things, to explain things to other workers and people we can reach, and above all, to organize to change society. It's no good just wallowing in pessimism and gloom. You could very easily. You could, reading that introduction from Martin Wolf's article that I mentioned earlier, you could wallow in gloom. But we've got to find a way to organize, to fight, to struggle, to change society. In the meantime, our main opponent, our main enemy is still the enemy at home, the British ruling class, the British capitalist class, and that's where our fight is.